In 1970, Simone de Beauvoir, one of the most celebrated intellectuals in France, the author of The Second Sex, the woman who had helped invent existentialist philosophy alongside Jean-Paul Sartre, sat down to write a book that none of her admirers expected and that made a great many of them deeply uncomfortable. She was 62 years old. She had spent her career thinking clearly about the things that civilizations prefer not to examine, about the construction of femininity, about the nature of freedom, about what it actually means to live as a self in a world that is always trying to define you from the outside. And now, she turned that same clarity, the same unflinching, thoroughly documented, completely unapologetic gaze toward the thing that the civilization she lived in found most uncomfortable of all. Not death, not illness, not any of the specific losses that the later decades bring, but aging itself, the process, the lived experience, the specific daily, deeply personal encounter with a body that is changing in ways you did not choose, and a world that responds to that change in ways that no one prepares you for. The book she wrote was called Vieillesse, in English, The Coming of Age, and it opens with a line that stops most readers cold the first time they read it and every time after. Old age, something beyond my life, outside it, something of which I cannot have any full inward experience, and yet there it is. Not resigned, not at peace with the discovery, not offering the comfortable wisdom that aging is simply a stage to be accepted with grace and gratitude and a softening of the ambitions that drove the earlier decades. Furious, in the specific, controlled, intellectually precise way that Simone de Beauvoir was furious about the things that deserved fury. And what she was furious about was not time passing, it was what the world does with time passing. The way a civilization uses age to make people invisible, to strip them of authority, to reduce the experienced, the hard-won, the fully arrived-at self to a category whose primary social function is to get out of the way. There is a particular experience that many people encounter somewhere in their 50s and that the culture around them has almost no honest language for. Not the fear of death, not the grief of specific losses, though both of those may be present, the experience of becoming, gradually and then suddenly, less visible, of entering a room that would have noticed you 10 years ago and finding in the specific quality of the not quite looking and the conversations that form without quite including you that something has changed. Not in the room, not in who you are, not in the accumulated knowledge and capacity and hard-won understanding that the decades have built, but in how the world reads the exterior that carries all of that. We live in a culture that has made youth the primary currency of worth. Not youth in the philosophical sense, not the openness, flexibility, the specific willingness to begin that genuine youth carries. Youth as appearance, youth as the specific configuration of the face and body that the market has decided signals relevance, desirability, the right to take up space and be attended to, and have your words treated as words worth hearing. And somewhere in the middle decades, not at a specific birthday, not in a single moment, but gradually over a series of small, perfectly ordinary encounters that each could be explained away and that together add up to something impossible to explain away. The people who are living this begin to understand that the world has assigned them a new category, and that the new category carries as its primary attribute a reduction of visibility that no achievement, no wisdom, no decade of accumulated understanding can fully reverse. De Beauvoir refused to make peace with this, not because she was vain, not because she clung to youth, because she was a philosopher, because she had spent her entire career arguing that the ways the world categorizes people are not neutral facts of nature, but political acts, choices, arrangements, systems designed to produce specific outcomes for specific people, and that the first step toward changing any of them is refusing the instruction to pretend they do not exist.
Simone de Beauvoir was born in Paris in 1908 into a bourgeois Catholic family that had fallen on harder times than its origins suggested. Her father was a lawyer of modest means and considerable charm, who had nonetheless instilled in her the conviction that the life of the mind was the only life worth having. Her mother was devout, traditional, and entirely unprepared for the daughter who would eventually become the most famous female intellectual in France. She studied philosophy at the Sorbonne, where she placed second in the Agrégation, the ferociously competitive national examination in philosophy, in the same year that Jean-Paul Sartre placed first. She was 21 years old. Sartre was 23. She had beaten every other candidate, every other man, every person in France who had sat that examination except one, and she would spend the next 50 years being introduced, in many of the rooms she entered, as Sartre's companion rather than as herself. She and Sartre built a relationship, open, complicated, intellectually extraordinary, personally costly in ways that her memoirs document with the same unsentimental honesty she brought to everything else, that lasted until his death in 1980. She published The Second Sex in 1949, the analysis of femininity as a social construction, of women as the other in a world organized around the male as the default human, that would eventually be recognized as one of the foundational texts of the 20th century. At the time of its publication, it was denounced from pulpits, attacked by conservatives and communists alike, and sold faster than it could be printed. She kept writing, she kept teaching, she kept thinking, with the specific, sustained, entirely unrelenting quality of attention that she had been applying to difficult questions since she was a student at the Sorbonne, about everything that the culture around her preferred to leave unexamined. When she turned 50, something changed, not in her work, which continued with the same force, but in the experience of moving through the world, in the specific, undeniable, perfectly ordinary way that the world was beginning to read her differently. To see first and most importantly the age, and to organize its response around the age rather than around the mind that the age was carrying. She noted it, she documented it, she turned the philosophical machinery she had spent a lifetime building toward it, and produced at 62 the book that is perhaps the most honest and the most politically serious account of aging that the 20th century produced. She died in 1986. She was 78 years old. She had outlived Sartre by 6 years and had spent those 6 years writing, organizing, advocating, still refusing, with the specific, magnificent, deeply characteristic stubbornness of a woman who had been refusing the world's categories since she was 21 to become what the category of old woman in the Paris of the 1980s was designed to make her. The Coming of Age is not a self-help book. It is an investigation, sociological, historical, literary, philosophical, into the condition of aging in modern Western societies, and what it finds is not comforting. De Beauvoir's central argument is structural. She says, and she documents this across cultures, across history, across the testimony of writers and workers and the old themselves, that old age is not a natural stage that arrives with its own inherent meaning and its own appropriate accommodation. It is a social condition, something done to people by the societies they live in. A systematic withdrawal of status, of economic security, of the right to be seen as fully human in all the complexity and capacity and irreducible personhood that a lifetime of experience has produced. She's angry about this, genuinely, documentedly angry, in the way that she was angry in The Second Sex about the construction of femininity. Not the anger of personal grievance, the anger of a person who has looked clearly at how a system works and refuses to pretend that what she sees is natural or inevitable or anything other than a choice that the civilization is making and could make differently.
But the coming of age is not only an indictment. It is also, and this is the part that gets less attention, the part that de Beauvoir herself considered more important than the politics, a philosophical investigation into what it means to remain a self across the full span of a life, what it means to keep the project of becoming alive. Not because the world is asking you to, not because the culture is celebrating it, not because anyone is watching, but because the alternative, the comfortable, socially approved, perfectly understandable settling into the category, is, in her precise and unsparing view, a form of death that arrives before the dying. She called it the trap of the internal gaze,
The moment, available at any age, but most seductive in the later decades, when a person stops orienting toward the future and begins organizing their inner life around the maintenance of what they have already become. The projects completed rather than the projects beginning. The identity secured rather than the identity still in motion. The self that has, without quite deciding to, concluded that becoming is something that happens to younger people and has settled, quietly, into the role of someone who has already arrived. This, de Beauvoir says, is the real danger, not the world's categorization, not the invisibility that the culture imposes, the invisibility that we impose on ourselves, the voluntary relinquishment of the project of becoming that is the one thing, the only thing, that no society, no culture, no system of age-based invisibility can take without our cooperation. Now, the bridge. Because de Beauvoir was writing in a specific political and cultural context, second-wave feminism, post-war France, the particular social landscape of aging in the 1970s, and the specifics of that context have shifted in the decades since. But here is what has not shifted at all. The experience of the room that no longer quite looks at you. The professional context where the ideas that would have landed differently 10 years ago now require a longer argument to receive the same hearing. The social world where the energy in the conversation moves gravitationally toward the younger people and requires a specific, effortful kind of presence to redirect. The morning in the mirror that is not about vanity, that is about the specific, quietly shocking recognition that the exterior the world reads and the interior that is doing the reading have become, without your full consent, increasingly different things. De Beauvoir's response to this is not consolation. She was not in the business of consolation, and she would have regarded any consolation that did not begin with seeing the situation clearly as an insult to the person receiving it. Her response is a demand that you refuse the internal gaze, that you keep the project of becoming alive, not as a performance of youthfulness, not as a refusal of reality, not as the kind of desperate clinging to diminishing returns that the culture celebrates as inspiration, and that is actually its own form of surrender, but as the genuine, philosophically serious, practically demanding orientation of a person who has decided, in the face of a world that has stopped asking them to, that they are still becoming something, still in motion, still directed toward a future that is genuinely open, not because youth is recoverable, and not because the losses aren't real, but because the project of becoming does not have an expiration date except the one you assign it to yourself. Here is what Simone de Beauvoir asks of you, practically, today. First, name what the world is doing and refuse to call it natural. De Beauvoir's first philosophical move, in The Second Sex, in The Coming of Age, in everything she wrote, was always the same. Look at the situation clearly. Name what is actually happening, not the comfortable story, not the naturalized account that makes the social arrangement look inevitable, but the real structure. Who benefits from the arrangement? What it costs the people it is arranged around? Whether it is in fact as inevitable as it presents itself as being. If you are experiencing the invisibility in the professional context, in the social context, in the cultural context that has quietly reassigned your relevance to a different category, name it, not as personal failure, not as the natural consequence of time, as a social arrangement that you did not design, did not agree to, and are not obligated to perform gratitude for.
The naming is not the solution, but it is the beginning, because you cannot refuse what you have agreed to call inevitable. Second, identify the project you are still becoming. This is de Beauvoir's most urgent practical question, not the project you completed, not the career that peaked, the book that was written, the children who were raised, the project that is still open, the thing you are still in motion toward, that is genuinely future, not the tending of what is already built,
that requires you to be someone you are not yet fully able to be. She is not asking for ambition in the conventional sense. She is asking for orientation, the specific quality of directedness toward a future that is genuinely open, that has not yet arrived, that will require you to grow into it, that keeps the self in motion rather than in maintenance. Find it, name it, not as a performance for anyone else, as the private, personal, completely serious answer to the question of what you are still becoming, and let that answer organize the next year of your life the way ambition organized the ones before. Third, resist the seduction of the internal gaze. De Beauvoir described the internal gaze, the turn inward toward the already built, the already become, as the specific temptation of the later decades, not laziness, not cowardice, something more seductive than either, the comfort of the self that has already been assembled, whose contours are familiar, whose stories are settled, whose identity does not need to be risked on anything new. Notice when the movement is inward and backward rather than outward and forward, the conversation about what things were like that occupies more space than the conversation about what things could become. The identity that is more about what you have done than about what you are doing. The gathering around the completed rather than the ongoing. That is the first, barely noticeable, entirely comfortable sign that the project of becoming has been quietly retired. Once today, in one conversation, in one internal moment, orient forward, not dramatically, not with forced optimism, with the specific de Beauvoir-grade seriousness of a person who has decided that the future is not something that happens to younger people, and that they are still, for all the world's opinion to the contrary, in the process of becoming someone they have not yet fully been. Fourth, find your solidarity. De Beauvoir believed and argued across all her work that the experience of being categorized, reduced, made invisible by a social system is always most powerful when it is experienced in isolation, when it is privatized, when the person living it believes that what they are experiencing is personal, the specific failing of this specific body in this specific life, rather than the structural, widely shared, thoroughly documented experience of an entire category of people that the civilization has organized around a set of assumptions it has not bothered to examine. Find the people who are living this alongside you. Not to commiserate, though commiseration, de Beauvoir would say, has its legitimate uses, to think together, to name together what is being done and what does not have to be accepted, to refuse together the instruction to grow quietly invisible, in the specific, practical, genuinely political sense of people who have decided that their experience matters, that their voices matter, that their continued becoming is not a private indulgence, but a refusal with consequences for everyone who comes after.
That is the practice, not the performance of youthfulness, not the desperate clinging to what was, the genuine, philosophically serious, personally demanding orientation toward what is still possible. Held publicly, named clearly, refused to be apologized for, by a person who has decided that the category does not own them yet. I want to close with the image I keep returning to when I think about Simone de Beauvoir. Not the Sorbonne examination, not the second sex, not the decades alongside Sartre in the cafes of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The desk in 1970. The 62-year-old woman who had been told in 1,000 small and not-so-small ways that her most important work was behind her, sitting down to write the most politically serious book about aging that the century would produce. Not from bitterness, not from fear, from the same conviction that had driven the second sex, that had driven everything she had ever written, that the world's comfortable categories deserved examination, that the examination was the beginning of change, and that a philosopher's job, her job,
The specific job she had been doing since she was 21 years old was to look at the thing clearly and say what she saw. She saw that her civilization was discarding its experienced, its accumulated, its hard-won, was trading wisdom for performance, was making invisible the very people who had the most reason and the most capacity to be seen. She refused to be quiet about it. She refused to make peace with it. She refused to perform the graceful acceptance that the culture had prepared for her as the appropriate response to growing older in a world that had stopped preparing a place for her at its table. And in refusing, in the clear, documented, philosophically rigorous refusal of a woman who had been refusing the world's categories for 40 years, she did the thing she had always done. She became more fully herself, more insistently, more visibly, more entirely, stubbornly, magnificently present in the world that had decided she should be fading. Here is the question Simone de Beauvoir leaves us with today. Not from the Sorbonne, not from the cafes, not from the second sex or the desk in 1970. From the project, from the specific, serious, still open question of what a person who refuses the instruction to become invisible does instead. What are you still becoming? Not what you have built, not the completed project, the raised children, the finished career. What is genuinely ahead, unfinished, unresolved, requiring you to be someone you have not yet fully been? And what would it mean to orient toward that, seriously, without apology, without the performance of graceful diminishment that the world has prepared for you, and to refuse, quietly and completely, to become invisible before you are done? Leave that in the comments. The project you are still becoming, the one the world has stopped asking about, the one that belongs to no category except your own. Because naming it, even briefly, even to strangers, is the beginning of the refusal that de Beauvoir spent her life arguing was the most important thing a person could do with the years the world had decided they no longer needed. I'll see you in the next one.